And good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this is another of our Friday night editions, what I've started to call them Lend Me Your EIRs. The Executive Intelligence Review writers have been appearing here, and folks from the Schiller Institute, all lined up with the courtesy of Marcia Malouk, who's been just terrific in providing me with the speaker lineup. So we're going to proceed now with somebody that's been with the LaRouche organization for quite a while, and he's their Latin American editor, both for the LaRouche Pub, and that means the EIR, as well as for Schiller Institute itself. So welcome to the show, Dennis Small. Hello, Dennis.
Hi, John. How are you? Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And let's start off with just learning a little bit about yourself, Dennis. Where are you from, and what type of education did you pursue? And I know that you got involved in the Lyndon LaRouche movement some years ago. So let's just bring us up to date with your basic history.
I was born in the United States in Miami Beach, Florida, actually. My family moved to Mexico when I was 3.5 years old. I grew up in Mexico. I speak Spanish. And when I graduated high school in Mexico, I came back to the States, went to Swarthmore College in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, majored in economics and philosophy, where I learned absolutely zero economics and that was good because usually what they teach is negative in these places. And everything I learned in economics really comes from my contact with Lyndon LaRouche, which began when I was in college. And ever since about 1971, I've been actively involved in the LaRouche movement. A large part of that time has been with special responsibility for the area of Latin America, or Ibero-America, as we sometimes call it. We have, over the years, had branches of the LaRouche organization in 5 or 6 countries in Latin America, most prominently Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Argentina. I've had the good fortune of traveling all over Latin America, and on a number of occasions also to Europe and as far east as the Philippines. I guess one of the more interesting moments in my life was I was sent to jail along with Lyndon LaRouche for crimes that none of us committed, and which the Bush administration knew absolutely perfectly that we hadn't committed. But LaRouche was framed up and set up, and as a political prisoner spent 5 years in jail. They were attempting to silence him. That absolutely did not work. And so that's actually one of the areas that I was involved in. I'm married. I've been married for 46 or 47 years to Gretchen Small. I may get in trouble now for not knowing the exact number, but it's been a long time, and it's going to be a lot more.
15. Mine's 15. I got my number.
Congratulations. That's good.
No, we just celebrated yesterday, so it was on my mind. Well, that's great. Congratulations on 46 years. That's terrific. And a fascinating bit of traveling you've done, and your ability to serve as an editor of for Latin America, because of your skills with the language. And I studied a couple of semesters of economics in college, and I didn't learn anything either. It was ridiculous. So the whole idea of economics really didn't make sense to me either until I started reading Mr. LaRouche's publications at EIR. And so you've been responsible for enlightening me before I even knew you. And the other publication which I bring to people's attention is this great book, Dope Inc., Britain's Opium War Against the World, which is, it's still going full blast. By the editors of EIR, and you are one of those said editors. So parts of the book are your work. Am I right about that, Dennis?
Yeah, I'm one of the co-authors of the book, along with a group of other researchers and writers at EIR. And all the way back in the 1970s, in 1978, I think it was, Lyndon LaRouche, for a variety of political reasons at the time, urged us to dig deeply into what was actually behind the international drug trade. And what we found was that the people running the drug trade, going back over a century to the China Opium Wars, were large British-based financial institutions, largely centered both in London per se, the city of London, but especially in offshore banking havens from which they operated. One of the centers of this was Hong Kong, which at the time was a British colony, and that was the world capital of the international drug trade. So what we did in this book is we went after the bankers, the British-run bankers, who are the ones actually behind the drug trade. There's a lot of victims, a lot of consumer victims in the United States, in Europe, in Southwest Asia, and there's a lot of producer victims as well, countries whose economies have been destroyed by Wall Street and the City of London, intentionally so, and driven into the drug trade. Today, we calculate that the size of the drug trade, and there's a couple of articles in there that go through how we do these calculations, is worth approximately $1 trillion per year. And that's what the banks launder. It's what's been crucial to keeping them afloat under conditions of a speculative blowout. And it's the policy which has meant, as all of their policies do mean this, death and destruction to populations and to the physical economy. Now, that book got us in a lot of trouble, good trouble to get into in a number of countries. Venezuela, where our offices were shut down, the books were seized. This was under democracy, supposedly. We were thrown out of the country. Plenty of trouble here in the United States, but that's because we went after the banking crowd that is actually responsible not only for the drug trade, but for the entire mess of the global financial speculative bubble, which is what is destroying the economy today. And it's also what's driving the world towards war, because they require that kind of confrontation to keep control of the entire system.
Well, you spent 2 years in jail yourself. Mr. LaRouche spent 5. Mike Billington spent 10. I'm sure there are others, and this is the work of the same. I mean, pardon me for just putting this out there, but it's the same people, it's the same mindset, and as a matter of fact, it's the same Robert Swan Mueller that prosecuted and persecuted you, and now has spent that last 3.5, 4 years on this crazy wild goose chase trying to persecute President Trump. These folks are representatives of the people behind the dope business, are they not? I mean, what
They are.
what they're doing is they're protecting this system, which is entirely a house of it. Without the dope, it would fall, would it not?
As President Biden likes to say, here's the deal. So here's what's going on with this drug trade and the financial situation.
Okay.
We have a global financial speculative bubble, which is completely out of control and is totally unpayable. If you look at the first slide, which I sent over to you, which is on world financial aggregates, this is our best estimate, our best calculation that we could come up with of the growth of all financial aggregates in the world, starting in 1980, going through about 2019. And there you see it on your screen. Now, this is a large mountain of financial speculative instruments. But as you can see, the upper blue part of the curve reflecting the stock market, which is a big bubble, is only a part of it. And in fact, a small part of it, maybe 10%. The second green part of this curve, which is all forms of debt, third world debt, corporate debt, public debt, private debt, all of the actual debt in the world, is also really only about 10% of the total. The lion's share, 80 to 85%, the red part of this curve, are financial derivatives. What are derivatives? Derivatives are speculative bets against losses which have already occurred. You basically bet on non-existent, from the standpoint of the physical economy, financial instruments, the future behavior of interest rates in Upper Mongolia, the process of decline of futures and derivatives on this, that, and the other. It's all completely monetary nonsense, but it's sold back and forth. And a bubble has developed out of this thing, which is completely out of control. Now, the doors to this were opened wide in 1999. The problem begins in 1971, really, when Nixon takes not only the dollar off the gold exchange standard, but probably more significant than that even, or related to it, is he establishes a floating rate exchange system with free convertibility in and out of any currency which is floating up and down. It's sort of like a floating crap game. And that allowed for enormous speculation to occur when there was no real production to back it. In 1999, what happens is that the Glass-Steagall legislation, which had been in place since 1933 with President Franklin Roosevelt, was lifted in 1999. And what that legislation did is that it put a firewall between productive commercial bank lending, what banks should do. You lend for productive activities. That's good. And a firewall between that and speculative investment banking. When that firewall was removed, this speculative cancer took over the entire financial system, as you can see in that zooming curve that went up, the derivatives went up, and it was backed by the federal government. The FDIC, under Glass-Steagall, backs individual commercial bank savings accounts. Once Glass-Steagall is removed, the FDIC backs all of the speculative gambling of the international speculative crowd. So that's out of control. In 2008, this thing blew up, but instead of a bankruptcy reorganization of the system, which is what was needed at that time, measures were taken which just made the problem much worse. And to quickly make that point, I'm sure you've heard of quantitative easing. Well, look at what happened with quantitative easing in the second graph. The cumulative quantitative easing back in 2007, when things blew out, is they just pumped money the hell into the whole system, led by the United States, followed by the ECB, the European Central Bank, and especially since last year, 2019 and 2020, this thing shot up. We now have close to $30 trillion of cumulative quantitative easing, which has not gone into the productive economy. It's gone into try to holding up the speculative bubble. It's not enough. It can't work. And to connect that back to the issue you were raising a moment ago, John, the drug trade, $1 trillion in the drug trade goes like this QE to try to hold up a speculative bubble which cannot possibly be maintained ad infinitum. So the pushing of the drug trade is both for financial reasons, but it's also to, as with the opium wars, to produce a drugged population that cannot think, that cannot fight back, that cannot be creative and come up with solutions of their own. And yeah, there you have some of the major trafficking routes which are known. And that's how this is tied into the drug question. There is a solution, of course, but it depends on understanding that you've got a speculative bubble which is completely out of control and it cannot possibly be saved. We have to put this through a bankruptcy reorganization and then start issuing credit for actual productive activity. And if we do that, we're going to find that we're going to be on very good terms with many other nations in the world who want the same thing, such as our friends in Europe and absolutely China and Russia as well. So the basis of a durable peace is a bankruptcy reorganization that puts Wall Street and the City of London out of business permanently. That's what LaRouche said, and it should be pretty clear why they threw him in the pokey.
Yeah, it is. And that's that's not good. And this, sadly, I hesitate to point out, but the fact is that LaRouche's name got pretty well dragged through the mud, as well as him being locked up. And that's something that is hard to overcome, I would expect, from your point of view, trying to talk about LaRouche. Is like me. I mean, I knew who LaRouche, I knew basically there was this LaRouche, and I remember some newspapers that they published, and but they got really bad press, and it all kind of disappeared from the paper. Um, maybe I'm more sensitive than most people, but I think there might still be some lingering uh, concern about LaRouche in the general public that you guys have got to overcome, because I mean it takes many hours to read, that go to LaRouchePub.com, which I do just about every day, and pick out articles from the past. They're so enlightening. They're so well written and so well documented. They're fabulous. But to get the real Lyndon LaRouche known by the public is got to be swimming uphill. I mean,
Upstream.
I'm a little embarrassed to ask the question, but I imagine you've run into that before.
Oh, no reason to be embarrassed. It's absolutely true, and the problem has to be overcome. The question is, why does that exist, and how do you overcome it? We have been fighting for the exoneration of LaRouche for many years. Despite the fact that he passed away about 2 years ago, this is still absolutely required, because although what they did to Lyndon LaRouche was a terrible injustice, and the fact that a number of others of us went to jail along with him, like Mike Billington, who you've had on your show, who spent 10 years in jail. I spent 2 years in jail. The fight, despite the fact that this was indeed an injustice to people who committed no crime whatsoever, the greater injustice here, it is what has been done to you and every other American citizen, because they have denied you or tried to deny you. You've had the perseverance to look into these things. Not everybody does. They don't have the disposition to do that, or they get scared. But the point is that LaRouche's ideas and his solutions for the crisis, which are so urgently needed now, have been denied to the American public, and they've been denied to the world largely because of this campaign. And that's why they did it. It wasn't that they were particularly concerned about LaRouche the person or something like that. They wanted to make sure that if they couldn't physically get rid of him, as they did with Martin Luther King or others, they would make it almost impossible for people to really sit down and study his ideas and make a decision for themselves on what they look at. So our battle for the exoneration of LaRouche is absolutely continuing. Point number one. Point number two, we have recently established as well the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, whose mission is to publish the entire collected works of Lyndon LaRouche, which is going to take, we don't know how many, 50, 100 volumes, large 600-700-page volumes to publish everything. Send it to university libraries, have it available, have it in the public libraries, let people figure it out for themselves. And so the LaRouche Legacy Foundation has that mission, and we are also are working on a digital archive, a digital available archive of everything that LaRouche produced. So that's point number two. Point number three on this is that reality itself has a way of teaching people a lesson. Now, what I mean by that is that ideas that people shirked or ran away from because they were unpopular or because people are threatened, you're going to get a knock on the door in the night from the FBI if you associate with LaRouche. They gave Trump that treatment for sure. They gave many of Trump's allies that treatment. Look what they did to Flynn. Look what they did to Roger Stone. I mean, they try to terrorize people into not thinking in silence. But when the world enters into a period of such grave crisis like today, that the only way to stop a global pandemic which threatens the existence of the planet, the only way to stop the drift to nuclear war, is to turn some ideas that were previously called very unpopular. That's when people turn to LaRouche. And that is happening now. It's happening in many parts of the world. And it is also happening in the United States. So it's the intersection of these ideas with a worsening crisis which opens the door, as it always has in times of history, to people thinking in a new way that they were not prepared to do previously. If everything was going fine before, you're probably not going to rock your own boat. But when you look around and you see what's going on in this country and around the world, if it punches you in the stomach to see the way people are dying in India or Nigeria or Peru from COVID, when there is no need for that to happen, when we could have vaccines for everybody, when we could have, most especially, a world public health system, a system in every country where people have the necessary medical and nutritional standards so that they're not so susceptible to these diseases. If that, really revolts you, and you look at what's happening to our culture, and you look at the drug problem, and you look to what the media is doing, and people at a certain point say, basta, that's it. Some people, like yourself, get to this earlier than most because they think. They like to think, and they like to make up their own mind. But under conditions of crisis, that kind of situation is contagious. So although I'm still angry, and I am, about spending a couple of years in jail for crimes I never committed, I'm still very proud that that was absolutely the right decision, and I'm committed to reversing that. And I'm also very optimistic about the prospects of getting the kinds of change that this country needs.
These derivatives, the big red blob, or it looks like it's undermining the real value of our economy. It's a big problem. It's a huge problem, and the biggest difficulty I see is exactly what happened to Lyndon LaRouche and your team. And that will just keep on happening as people raise their voices and say, look what's happening. I see what's happening. We've got to stop this. And then, they've just got their hammer out and they say whack-a-mole, and, there's another one popped his head up, whack, and that's what they did to you. And that's what they will do they're doing to an Assange, for instance, or setting what I think George Webb's put it pretty well. He said, it's the dead coyote hanging on the barbed wire fence. It means that it's a warning to all the other coyotes not to try to cross the fence. Don't put your head up is the word, and accept the narrative, and gosh, everybody's still watching CNN, and they're still watching the television, and I think we are making progress, but I'm not nearly as optimistic as you are. What about the organized crime problem? Because the CIA and the organized crime are basically the same thing at this point, and we need to recognize the fact that those guys, they do nasty things if you upset their apple cart, and if you don't let them get the money out of their derivatives, hey, I've got this piece of paper here that says that you owe me $1 million and I want my $1 million. And you say, oh, that piece of paper's not worth anything. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, yes, it is. Manny, come out of the back room, Manny. He needs to talk to Manny. You want to talk to Manny?
The power of these people is built on quicksand. It's built on a financial system which is going down. It is bankrupt. They don't have the money to invest. For example, in Europe, Biden just went over there, and Biden's whole trip was a total disaster. I mean, the policies of this administration are a total disaster on the green front, on the special relationship with the British, on strengthening NATO to attack Russia and China. except when he got to the meeting with Putin, something positive happened. And that has a lot to do with a realist faction inside the United States and internationally. But one of the things that occurred is over there at the G7 meeting, Biden went through a whole thing about how we are preparing an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And we're going to provide a lot of investment in infrastructure so people don't have to turn to the Chinese. Well, it's very simple. That's words. There is no capability of doing what China has done. Pull 850 million people out of poverty, build 35,000 kilometers of high-speed rail line, provide vaccines to many countries around the world, and launch the Belt and Road Initiative, which has built infrastructure and is working with countries based on an economic policy which actually is extremely close to the American system of Alexander Hamilton. That's the real irony of this thing. So you get Biden over there talking about all of this help they're going to give people. It's not there to be given. So reality intercedes in these things, and they can talk good talk, and there's a lot of threats, and yes, they do terrible things to people, but their entire power is premised on a financial system which is bankrupt and is going to go down, is falling apart. The only question is, do we, the rest of the world, actually make sure that they're the ones who go down and that the planet doesn't blow up instead? Here's what the problem looks like. If you don't mind, I'll show you a couple more graphs, which I think make the point.
I like your graphs. You do good graphs.
Okay, thank you. Number 3, this is Lyndon LaRouche's famous triple curve. And we could spend a lot of time on this, but I'll be very brief, which is that the upper curve here, there's 2 upper curves, the green one called monetary aggregates, and then the red one called financial aggregates. Basically, that's what we were just looking at in real numbers that I showed you before of the derivatives.
Can I interrupt you? I've skipped over this the last time, and I want to catch a definition of what is exactly meant by the word aggregates.
Total, just total.
Anything financial, anything monetary.
Everything you aggregate or add together. It just means the total financial instruments, everything that's a financial piece of paper. And that includes derivatives, it includes stocks, it includes debts, it includes everything.
Okay.
And that's rising hyperbolically. The rate of change is very fast. The lower curve, the physical economy, the yellow one, called physical economic input output, but it means the physical economy, that's food per capita, energy per capita, railroads, capital goods, science, technology, health, education, the things that you actually need to survive. That has been going down for the world and for the United States ever since approximately 1971, or even a little earlier with the assassination of Kennedy. So you've had this collapse of the physical economy while the monetary aggregates grow. Now, you do not have to be a rocket scientist to know that if the red line and the green line are going up and up and the yellow line is going down and down, at a certain point, this is going to blow apart. And this is classically what happens in a financial breakdown crisis. And that's exactly what's going on right now. There is no way that this thing can actually be maintained. What they are doing is pumping money into it with no backing whatsoever in order to try to keep the bubble afloat. And the only thing that that does is it makes sure that when it does blow, it's going to blow bigger and worse. The problem here, John, is the physical economy, because the financial instruments may be growing, but take a look at what's happened in the next graph to U.S. manufacturing employment. Now, this is just over a short period of time, from 98 till 2019, but you can see the very significant drop that occurred in U.S. manufacturing employment in millions. If you were to take this graph back to the end of World War II, you would see a rapid decline in the percentage of the labor force employed in manufacturing from 1945 to the present. We collapsed. We became a post-industrial economy. And if you look at the world situation, it's even worse, far worse, as you can see in this last graph on world real unemployment. where real means it doesn't mean holding a job producing nothing, like running drugs or selling chewing gum on the streets of the cities in a third world country. Employment means producing something useful and productive. You have this huge informal economy, which is unproductive all around the world. And our estimates is that about 46% of the entire world labor force is in fact unemployed, over 1.5 billion, which is why we wrote a program that said how you have to build 1.5 billion new jobs around the world to get out of this mess. And that's what the United States should be doing. The leading edge of this is addressing, along with other countries, the world health crisis, this pandemic mess. The reason that we have this pandemic is because we have allowed the physical economy of the world to sink down below the ability to maintain the existing population. So you're going to get one thing or another. You're going to get wars, you're going to get pandemics, you're going to get unemployment, you're going to get blowouts. Which specifically you get and when, that's a political question. But it's going to happen because you are not producing physically what's needed to keep people alive. And that's exactly where the power of Wall Street and the City of London and their henchmen that you were referring to runs into a brick wall. That's reality. Reality is a very harsh taskmaster in these things. And when that happens, people who were willing to sit back and say, let somebody else deal with this, that's when people get really angry and decide they need a change. Now, this is a process which has actually been going on around the world for, 10 years maybe. What's this explosion against the establishment, against the existing parties and so on? The Brexit vote in the UK was a vote against the same old Brussels crowd running everything again. The vote for Trump, I guess it hasn't been 15 years, but it's been a while. The vote for Trump was a vote of people, Democrats and Republicans, saying, hey, we've had it with the establishment. We want someone who's going to kick over the chessboard. And Trump did that, or he tried to. He didn't know enough economics. He didn't have the necessary policies. He didn't stick to it the way he needed to. And that's one of the reasons he got outflanked and defeated. But he came in as an anti-establishment figure. He is not part of the Washington crowd. That's true. But you had the same thing in Italy with a government there that implemented a deal with China. We had the same thing in Mexico with the election of López Obrador, who got swept into power by masses of people who said, I've had it with the existing parties. Now, Mexico is Mexico, so the populist wave was center-left. The United States is the United States, so the populist wave leaned more towards center-right or conservative, whatever you want to call it. But the important thing is not those political labels. The point is people have had it. And that's what you're starting to see again. There was just a vote in Switzerland just a few days ago where the issue of green environmentalism, of shutting down the economy on behalf of this cockamamie theory, which is false scientifically, of global warming based on anthropogenic or climate man-produced results. This was voted down massively by the Swiss population. It's the first time anyone in the establishment dared put it to a vote. They had to do it in Switzerland. And the Swiss population said, no way. Just as the American population would vote no way, the same in Germany, people aren't given the choice. So you've got a real crisis going on here where ideas that make a difference can shape the world in a way that didn't work before. And it's to that purpose which we in the Schiller Institute will be holding an international conference this coming weekend, a week from tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday, the 26th and 27th, on the global crisis and the economic policies that are needed to do something about that. And I would strongly invite you and any of the people listening to your program to join us in that discussion, in that dialogue. I guarantee you it will be extremely interesting, and I am convinced very important as well. That's what the title is, exactly what you have on the screen, for the common good of all people, not rules benefiting the few.
What you say really should be a dramatic warning to people, but I guess the boiling water hasn't quite reached the brain of the frog yet, and the frog is still thinking, "Oh, this is a nice warm bath." The but at a certain point, the bubbles are going to start, and they're going to start to, "Hey, it's getting a little too hot in here. I think I'd like to jump out of this fishbowl." But is it going to be too late? In other words, what's going to happen to our pension plans? What's going to happen to the average person when this financial bubble gets taken down? Is it not going to have to be surgically extracted and surgically, really carefully extracted in such a way that the people who are taking the risks bear the burden, and not the people that have trusted the system with their savings and their futures?
Yeah, you've got two good points there. One is the boiling water and the frog, and the other is how you deal with this to make sure that the physical economy and the people survive. On the boiling water, it's true. Most people, most of the population will tend to act like that proverbial frog that just sits in the water as it gets hotter and hotter until it's so hot he's not capable of jumping out anymore. However, human beings aren't frogs, most. And what I mean by that is that in history, it always takes a handful of people, not all frogs, just a few, who realize what's going on, who don't wait until it's too late, who jump the hell out of the boiling water, who sound the alarm, who talk to other people, who tell them what's going on. And it's usually a bunch of black sheep. It's people who are not listened to for most of the time, what you were talking about earlier, right? People say, it's those LaRouche people, they're so crazy. And then all of a sudden, when things get really nasty, people say, wait, where are those LaRouche people? Someone was talking about this. I know someone was talking about this. Where are they? So don't expect most people to respond in a way that will actually properly take on the problem. But it doesn't take most. It takes a few people. It takes a handful of people in history, like with the Renaissance. The Golden Renaissance did not come from a majority vote of the Italian population. It came from a handful of people, the Brunelleschis, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Cervantes in Spain, the Shakespeare in the UK, Rabelais in France, and so on and so forth, who led the way for a scientific breakthrough, a political breakthrough, a cultural breakthrough for the whole of humanity. And that makes a huge difference, because under conditions of crisis, if you have people sounding a clear note, a clear trumpet, then you have a possible solution. So I don't know if it's going to be too late or not, but what I can tell you is that human beings aren't frogs, and that life isn't going to the horse races where you sit around and bet and see who's going to be the winner. If it were that, you could probably bet that it wasn't going to happen and we would lose. But life is not gambling. This is the real world. We have to do this, and we can do this, and it can be turned around. Now, that's one point. The second point of how do you do this without everyone losing their pensions and the economy shutting down, that is a real serious question and a serious problem. And that's where the longer you wait, the more difficult it is. But it can be done, and Lyndon LaRouche laid out the basis for the exact steps that need to be taken to bring this about. And I'll summarize this quickly. It's his 4 laws, his 4 points that he has stated on a number of occasions. The first thing you do is you reimpose Glass-Steagall, exactly as FDR had defined it, for the purpose of stopping the looting. You simply say the speculative cleanser is frozen, it's done with, it's out. Glass-Steagall gets reinstated. That's step number 1. If you do that, if you freeze the entire speculative bubble, you're going to be left with very little by way of an actually functioning credit system or productive banking system, which was the point you were just making. So you have to immediately, at the same time, after a weekend's bank holiday, it doesn't take more than that, just as Roosevelt did it, the next Monday or Tuesday, you establish a Hamiltonian credit system. That means You have a nationalized Fed, or a new national bank of the United States, just like we had with Washington and we had with Lincoln, which takes control of the process of issuing credit, new credit, throughout the economy. So what do? You freeze the stuff that's speculative. You keep intact as best you can people's pensions, credit, payroll credit lines for companies so that there's no waves of bankruptcy, all of those kinds of things that are needed. And you then establish a policy that national credit is directed into high productivity, advanced technology projects to reemploy everybody productively. And LaRouche's 4 laws indicated there, starting with Glass-Steagall, but only starting with Glass-Steagall because you immediately have to move to an American credit system to be able to issue the credit that otherwise you're going to be lacking. It's like a transfusion. If you just get rid of the cancer and only that, the patient's going to die. You have to provide new tissue, new blood, new circulation, new credit system. And then what you have to do is you have to make sure that that credit is going towards high energy flux density infrastructure projects. What that means is advanced technology. You don't go backwards in technology towards windmills and solar panels and so on, which are completely inefficient and a waste. You lose money, you lose productive value when you invest in them. You've got to go forward to fusion power, matter, antimatter. You have to move forward with space science and colonization. We have to move forward with optical biophysics to deal with medical problems and so on. You're going to build high-speed rail lines around the world with maglev and so on. You're going to set up nuclear desalination plants to produce fresh water where you don't have it, and so on and so forth. Credit channeled in that way produces more by way of a return than you have to provide as an interest rate. You set a low interest rate, 2-3%, your actual increase in productivity will be greater than that. So that credit is not inflationary. If it's directed into production, it's anti-inflationary. And you use those projects as the basis for setting up agreements with other countries around the world. Don't worry about ideology and who reads what books or who has what religion. I mean, the worst thing to do when you have a religious war is to say, well, we're going to solve the religious war by fighting it out on religious terms. That was what destroyed Europe in the 30 Years' War. It was the Treaty of Westphalia that came in and said, we're putting that behind us. We are not going to solve that. We're going to look to the common interests of mankind. You want to solve the problem of the Middle East? Don't try to solve it on religious terms between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Set up a massive water project that benefits both populations, railroads, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and so on and so forth. And that's the basis for our coordination and cooperation with Russia and China. We don't have to agree or disagree with socialism or socialism with Chinese characteristics or Confucianism. They don't have to agree with Benjamin Franklin, although people are going to find out if they do a little reading that Benjamin Franklin was one of the greatest and most committed people dedicated to Confucianism. He thought it was fantastic. Our Benjamin Franklin. So there's a lot of history here that becomes interesting. And if you do that and you focus on these advanced areas of science and technology, you will not only keep the machine running of the economy, but you'll gear it up to a much higher level. So it does have to be done surgically. It has to be done very carefully. It has to be done quickly, but it has to be done decisively because these guys have got to be put out of business. And the easiest way to do it is bankruptcy reorganization.
Well, thank you. And I think you've got a sound, the 4 principles and the idea of freezing. And I love the way you captioned one of your own presentations was the way to cure COVID is to quarantine Wall Street. And I think that's a great image. Quarantining Wall Street is because Wall Street is sick. Wall Street has cancer. And the cancer is these worthless pieces of paper, derivatives, et cetera, that are held onto, by these people that think they have value, but they don't have value unless they, can force some value out of these pieces of paper. And the, when the Congress allowed the speculative investment banking to invade our commercial banking system, that's it. I mean, the barn doors open and the horses are flying. I mean, how are you going to get the horses back in the barn after you just opened the door wide open? And every crook and criminal in the world, I mean, BCCI, the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, every crook and criminal in the world has got his money on Wall Street now. And there's more crooked money on Wall Street now than there is legit money on Wall Street. So what congressman is going to say, hey, you know what? I think we should just reinstate Glass-Steagall, and he thinks he's going to survive the next election. They will crush him. They will take that big hammer and they will crush that guy or woman who stands up and says, we need Glass-Steagall. But I don't think there's any other body in this country that can actually pass a law that says Glass-Steagall is back. So how do we shake this Congress up and say, hey, you guys are really screwing up. We need you guys to put this Glass-Steagall back so we can at least make a start at restoring the real economy, the real credit, the real full faith and credit that people can have in the U.S. economy has got to be based on an American banking system. It's obvious to me, after having studied it with you guys for a few months, that is the solution. But how do you get from here to there? That just troubles me no end. I don't know how to do it.
Well, it's already happening in some places. I mean, it's called a pitchfork brigade. It's called the population gets so furious that they make it clear to those congressmen that they may fear the bankers who won't bankroll their campaigns if they don't do what the bankers want, but have them fear the population even more, that they're going to be voted out of office. And that's a language that they understand very, very well. When I say it's already happening, look, there are parts of the farm states, Midwest, and so on and so forth, where this entire policy of 30 for 30, which is a banker's policy. This comes from Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, and from the Davos crowd, and so on and so forth. The idea of 30 for 30, which is to remove from production 30% of the arable land, 30% of the water, 30% of everything by 2030, supposedly to protect the environment. Well, that's very popular on Wall Street, but guess what? It's not very popular in Kansas and Nebraska, and so on and so forth. And there is now a real revolt going on, and even some congressmen are beginning to stand up a little bit on this thing, because they know, you have farmers and you have others who are being driven out of business because of this. And and that's the reality of the situation. I'm watching on the screen this Bill Clinton occasion with the revocation of the Glass-Steagall bill. I mean, that bill should, which Clinton signed, in fact, in 1999 with a number of the sponsors behind him, really should be called the Monica Lewinsky bill, because the reason that it happened is that the same Wall Street banking crowd launched an operation to overthrow, to topple, to get rid of Bill Clinton the same way they did with Donald Trump. And for the same general reasons, which is that Clinton was looking towards a new financial architecture. So you had a whole impeachment drive, which was, built up around a whole operation that was run and possible foibles by the president. I don't know. And frankly, that's not the basis on which you throw someone out of the White House. I'm not in favor of what he clearly did, but this was an operation that was set up for the purpose of getting him out of the White House. And they used that as the hammer to force him into accepting these policies of revoking Glass-Steagall. I don't think he should have done it. I think it was a terrible decision that he made. But the actual force behind this, the power behind it, was the same Wall Street crowd that then later went after Donald Trump. So that's the point: is you get a population that's really angry by what's happening. They start to realize that they've got to exercise some political muscle. And then congressmen, who are neither the brightest nor the most courageous species known to the human race, begin to think about acting in the proper fashion. So that's how reality and politics can affect what otherwise might seem to be a hopeless situation.
Reality, yeah, it's and I love your image of we're not just going to the races and watching the horses come in and seeing betting on who's going to win, but that's what it seems like when our population is watching television all the time and thinking, well, I'm for Trump, I'm for Biden, I'm for Trump, I'm for Biden. Well, what for, why? Nobody knows why. It's just that people on the Biden side think Trump is a creep, and people on the Trump side think Biden is a creep. And, it's all a negative voting system of I'm voting against the bad guy. And that's as far as the analysis goes. I live in a jurisdiction where we have a Congressman, Steny Hoyer, who is one of the most powerful people in the House of Representatives, one of those really, really noble looking people with a tremendous voice, tremendous way of presentation. And he was a trial lawyer when I was a trial lawyer, so we'd see each other now and then, but nobody's going to get him out of office. He is like the guarantee of all the military bases in Maryland. And there's nothing that people love more than military bases when you're talking about running for office. I need to have my military bases, doggone it. And if you're not going to keep my military bases, then I am not going to vote for you. I guess that's another aspect to the whole thing, is that so much of our economy is when they've just dispersed all the bases all around the country. And some people get to put this little ornament on the F-35, and some other people get to put a different ornament on the F-35. If the F-35 is ever going to be built, the military industrial complex is also a huge part of our economy. Maybe we could spend a couple of minutes thinking about that.
I actually think that the problem is a little bit different than that, and especially the solution, because the actual realm of action, political action, things that actually change a country, change the world, the domain of statecraft is not the domain of simply the physical things you see in front of you, the votes, the money, the bases, the this and that and the other. It's the domain where ideas intersect that process in the physical world, especially the physical economy. And the question of how ideas, just ideas, which have no weight, no smell, no dimension, they're not physical, but how an idea, a proposal, a concept, a program can produce a change is critical to actually understanding what's happened and bring about changes. This is the area which Lyndon LaRouche was a master of, because the issue is the role of the mind, of creativity, in changing the physical universe around us. His major discovery in economics was not the question of Hamilton. Hamilton discovered Hamilton. Not the question of greenbacks. Well, Lincoln had greenbacks. It's the question of the role of human creativity in producing physical economic changes that affect the potential relative population density of the planet. In other words, produce enough power in the economy and growing power through creativity and technological advance that we can solve problems. And that takes you into a domain which is really kind of the complex domain, in much the same way that Gauss talked about complex numbers. It involves a immaterial force, an idea, and physical developments, and the causal relationship between the two. Now, that may sound very abstract and philosophical, but how do you think Ronald Reagan adopted the SDI policy back in 1983? He adopted it because Lyndon LaRouche developed this idea over years and years and years and hammered and hammered and hammered. It came from LaRouche. It came from discussions with the Reagan group, this public record. And Ronald Reagan adopted that policy on March 23rd, 1983, from a guy, Lyndon LaRouche, who was never elected to office, has no money, has no power apparently, but he had a program and a policy and idea that worked, made sense, and was needed urgently. And you had Ronald Reagan, who went with it. That's what shaped the subsequent developments. The ideas now that led to this very small change that happened on this meeting between Biden and Putin comes from exactly that same background. It's this idea that was expressed in the Biden-Putin communique. Today, we reaffirm the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That phrase was stated in joint communique by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1985 at that exact same location in Geneva, Switzerland. And it came not because Gorbachev was a good guy or Reagan understood everything, but because Reagan was working off the basic concept which LaRouche had developed and presented around the SDI. And that still affected the discussions with Gorbachev, and that's what came out of it. Now we have a slight opening, not a big one. It's no great, don't bring out the trumpets yet or the champagne for what just happened. What's important is not that specific statement that came out of the Biden-Putin meeting. What's important is the way it was produced. With the world on a trajectory to confrontation, there was some backing down from those who wanted to put Ukraine in NATO. They understood that that was a red line for the Russians and it was going to blow the world apart. They decided it was the wrong way to go. There was discussions among people on both sides, of realist people on the Russian side and the American side, saying, why don't we at least go back to what happened in '85 with Reagan and Gorbachev? And that's what they've done. How do we move forward now? We have to get people working on solving the pandemic. We need a global health policy, which is urgently required and immediately forces a situation where we've got to solve these economic and financial problems. It brings an idea smack center stage into that complex domain where real politics actually occurs. That's where the so-called rubber meets the so-called road. It's where ideas, the ideas mesh, the grain, like in gears that mesh, it meshes with what's happening in the real physical political world. And it does happen through ideas whose time has come, which work, which function, and intersects a population which is increasingly dissatisfied and upset without even knowing what they're upset and dissatisfied about. Again, I want to end urging people to participate in our conference this coming Saturday and Sunday, not tomorrow, but next Saturday and Sunday, 26th and 27th, where for 2 full days, these ideas will be discussed with very prominent people from Russia, China, Europe, Africa, the United States, and from around the world. That is where history is going to actually be made.
Well, discussions like this and dialogues like this are essential. That's why I do it. I'm sure that's why you guys have been doing it for so much longer than I am. And the idea that we would give up or that we would lose the goodwill to carry on is simply not going to happen. So I think there is a tremendous willingness to confront problems once people see that we've got a problem. And you've illustrated tonight, I think, with your charts and with your description, not only the problem, but also the path to get out of the problem. It's not going to be easy, but we have to face it and we have to join together and we have to reason through these problems together with goodwill and with thoughts of the posterity and the future of the planet. So I can't thank you enough for your work and for your sacrifices to do the work and keep up the good work. And we'll be back and talk to you again soon, I hope, Dennis. It's really been a pleasure.
Pleasure's been mine.